The world planners want every person on earth to have a universal ID number. They want it so that every person can be entered into a database. This will allow all to be tracked and controlled. Mark Lerner's newest book is Your Body is Your ID. And he is our guest for today's edition of Politics and Religion.
Look, there are two things I don't discuss: politics and religion.
In my house, we don't talk about politics and we don't talk about religion.
I'll talk to you about anything except politics and religion.
I never talk about politics and religion.
Politics determines how we'll live here on earth. Religion determines how we'll live forever. I'm Irvin Baxter. I think it's time we talk about it. Well, are you ready for your universal ID? Soviet Union has, or actually Russia has just announced that in 2012 they will implement a universal ID card. India has done it this past year. Greece has now ruled that any cash transaction over 1,500 euros is a crime. And the move toward a cashless society and a universal ID system seems to be gaining momentum right now. So how do you feel about that? Would you like to have an ID so you could go anywhere in the world, buy anything in the world, and be tracked anywhere in the world? Don't forget that part. And if they want to find you, they can find you like immediately. So do we want to live in this great glass house like fish in a fish bowl? Or do we like the anonymity of freedom? Well, that's what's at stake here. And we have a guest who's been with us before on our program, Mr. Mark Lerner. He is a wonderful proponent of freedom. He also has done much to defeat some of the more intrusive aspects of the universal ID here in America called Real ID. And we've asked Mark to be on our program today. His latest book is Your Body is Your ID. He is with us today, and we're so happy to welcome Mark Lerner back to Politics and Religion. Hello, Mark.
How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing really good, Mark. It's great to have you back on, and I want to tell everybody that you are probably America's foremost vigilante when it comes to guarding us against all of us having a national ID that we are forced to carry with us day and night. And we really do appreciate the work that you have done, Mark, so thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be on the show again. And I think we have some exciting news today for your listeners.
Good. We're anxious to hear it.
We have worked up a alternative solution to Real ID, one we think will satisfy people that have legitimate concerns over voter fraud, people in our country illegally being able to obtain benefits, over identity theft, and also the issue of terrorists being able to use a state driver's license to facilitate their actions. Our solution addresses each of those issues, and we also have state legislation available for every state that will protect the rights of citizens and states against the federal government's intrusion into the issuance of a state driver's license.
Well, that's very good. And Mark, we're so anxious to hear, before you go into that, however, we may have new listeners here that may not know much of what we're talking about. So could you just maybe give us a very brief outline of the history of ID cards here in the United States of America and the world, just so they'll get a quick overview of what we're talking about and why it's so important?
Well, we could go back to the 1800s and actually into the early 1900s and talk about the fact that even a state driver's license was not required. But for the purposes of the discussion today, I'm going to jump ahead to the Real ID Act 2005. The Real ID Act 2005, we were told, was passed and signed into law by President Bush as a result of the recommendations by the 9/11 Commission. But what is important for Americans to understand is the 9/11 Commission made suggestions. Now, one of those suggestions called for the Real ID Act itself. So what the Real ID Act did was involve the issuance, or the federal government in the issuance of a state driver's license. Now, and let me go to why that's so bad. First of all, you're right. We need to get people up to speed. 2 international organizations were directly involved in the drafting of the Real ID Act.
Now you said now, Mark, you said 2 international organizations.
2 international organizations.
So this was not domestic. This was not U.S. These were coming from a world government standpoint.
Absolutely. The standard on state driver's licenses for the digital photo image, the photograph, is the adopted standard of the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, an agency of the United Nations. That's where the standard comes for the driver's license photo. That's important because that standard is specifically designed to make your photo what we call facial recognition compatible. That means they can take your photo, they can capture a facial image of you out in public, do what we call mapping your face digitally, and compare the image captured by the camera against the photo that's in the state DMV databases.
So how accurate is that? Could they take your picture in Hong Kong, and could they then track you using that mapping technique, and they would know who you were? Are we there to that degree yet?
We're well past that point. Yes is the answer to your question. We are there, but in addition to being able to determine your identity, which means you have no anonymity, through the use of your Social Security number and other information, whether you're in Hong Kong or the United States, any information in your state DMV database would be available to authorities or governments, regardless of where they're located around the world.
So with your facial scan, then once they tap into that, they tap into the database using your facial scan, and they'll probably get your Social Security number, your birth certificate, and a lot more.
Your Social Security number, absolutely. There are 2 federal laws that require state motor vehicles to require your Social Security number. One is what we call the Welfare Reform Act that deals with parents that don't pay child support, and the other deals with sexual predators. Now, that being said, our legislation understands the importance. We want people to pay their child support. We understand the importance of that. We have come up with a way to satisfy the Department of Human Services, which is usually the state agency responsible for child support, to satisfy their concerns. What we recommend is, if you have to provide, and you do by federal law, your Social Security number at the time you apply for your driver's license, it only stays, in the state DMV database for 72 hours, long enough to do the required federal government checks. And after that 72-hour period, your Social Security number is removed from the state DMV database.
Okay.
But I want to make this point that when we talk about a state driver's license under the Real ID Act, and the Real ID Act, I want people to know this, 100 days from now, the Real ID Act is due to be implemented. In other words, even though it was a federal law that was signed in 2005, the implementation date is May 2011. about 100 days from right now. Now, we have mounted an offensive against the Real ID Act, and currently 26 states, through law or resolution, have declared they would not comply with the Real ID Act. But that's the state legislatures talking. The bureaucrats at the state level that are involved with the Department of Public Safety, law enforcement, they've been moving forward, meeting the 18 benchmarks DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has laid down to be compliant with Real ID. So on one hand, state legislators are saying no, but the bureaucrats are moving ahead, meeting the benchmarks required by Real ID.
So are they doing that in opposition to state law then? Have the states passed, some of the states have passed laws forbidding compliance to Real ID requirements. So are the bureaucrats violating state law?
In some instances, they actually are. Now, I can tell you, we have spent our organization a great deal of time in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is one of the first few states to pass by law they would not comply with Real ID. Now, out of the 18 benchmarks, Oklahoma has met the fewest of any state in the continental United States. Oklahoma has only met 8 of the benchmarks. So it does show that where different groups and organizations come together and they speak to their state legislators, they go to their capital, they can have an effect on what happens. It's not by accident that Oklahoma has met fewer of these benchmarks than any other state in the continental United States. Now, what I really want people to understand, and I know this is where politics and religion come together, the international organizations that I'm talking about, we have no representation with those organizations. You in your home, me, or anybody else listening to this show, it's not like you can pick up the phone and call your state representative or even your U.S. senator. When you're talking about international organizations, there is no representation. So I want people to understand the state driver's license must be a sovereign document just as the state is sovereign. Now, our alternative proposal deals directly with the issuance of birth certificates and death certificates. There is a way for every state to what we call authenticate birth certificates. And this is a very important issue. Right now, there are 3 states that have digitized all their birth records, and when they issue a driver's license, part of that process includes authenticating the birth certificate that's presented to make sure it is, in fact, a valid birth certificate. 18 other states have also digitized their birth certificates, but before they...
I'll tell you what, Mark, let me interrupt you right there because we're up against a break and we're listening. We're so interested in what you're saying. We'll be back in just a moment, ladies and gentlemen, with Mark Lerner.
Every Monday at 9 p.m. Central on the Church Channel and at 10 p.m. Central on Daystar, Irvin Baxter presents End of the Age. End of the Age is a 30-minute program which gives intricate details about how Bible prophecy is not only true, but also how it lines up so perfectly with events going on in the world right now. Don't miss one End of the Age program every Monday at 9 p.m. Central on the Church Channel and at 10 p.m. Central on Daystar. Visit endtime.com for more details or call 1-800-ENDTIME.
When you think about Bible prophecy or the end of the world, what comes to mind? War, destruction, famine, disease, 666, mark of the beast, antichrist, false prophet, 4 horsemen, trumpets, seals, and vials. What about 2012? How does all of this affect you as a teenager in today's world? Those are all good questions, but the thing to remember is that Bible prophecy was not put here for us to be afraid of it, but for us to know what is to come. When I was a kid, I used to pretend that I could see the future and predict what was going to happen.